No two manufacturers produce Sherman tanks exactly the same. When you consider that there were 11 different companies making Sherman tanks, 10 in the United States, 1 in Canada, you start to get an idea of why one Sherman tank could be so different from another. Even within the same company, to make things more complicated, a manufacturer often changed the way it made Sherman tanks over time. An early production tank might be very different from a late production tank. To add to the complexity, once these tanks got out into the field in a variety of different configurations, they were changed quite a bit, and they were changed unequally. It wasn't like the same change to each tank. A change might be applied to this tank, a different change to that tank, and at the end of the day, it was very hard to find any two Sherman tanks that were exactly the same. I'm going to use the M4 Sherman tank we have in our combat vehicle rotunda to show you what we're talking about. After we review the details of our M4 Sherman, I'm going to compare it to our EZ8 Sherman tank. Let's start with a clarification on Sherman tank terminology. Every Sherman tank was an M4 series tank, but only Shermans manufactured to the original design were designated M4s. Shermans manufactured to variations on that original design had different designations. For example, the final design Sherman tank was the M4A3E8 or EZ8, we're going to talk about next. Our M4 is serial number 1788. It was manufactured by American Locomotive, or ALCO, in April 1943. It has typical M4 features. It has a 75 millimeter main gun. It is a welded hull, not a cast hull or a riveted hull. You can see weld lines on this hull. It had a final drive armor cover consisting of 3 components bolted together, relatively narrow tracks, as you see here, 16-inch or 40 centimeter wide tracks. The M4 had an original smaller turret, you'll see as we contrast it with the later EZ8 Sherman. Ammunition was conveniently stored in 3 racks placed against the walls of the hull. 1 on the left side of the hull, 2 racks on the right side of the hull. When the Army Ordnance Department finalized the design of the M4, it thought it created a pretty good tank, but in fact, there were a lot of problems with this design that weren't appreciated until it got out into the field and Americans started dying crewing these Sherman tanks. One of the problems was the slope of the glacis. An unintended consequence of this 56-degree slope is it didn't encompass the hull hatches. The hull hatches are sticking out in front of the hull, creating what are called hoods that were ideal aiming points in a ballistic weak spot in the front armor. So here we send M4 Sherman crews out into combat with bullseyes prominent right on front of the hull. When the Army Ordnance Department finally recognized this problem, its Band-Aid solution was to send armor plates out into the field to be welded to cover these hoods like you see here. Another problem with the original M4 Sherman was the armor covering the final drive. These 3 pieces bolted together created another ballistic weak point at each of these connections. You'll see later the Army Ordnance Department required solid armor plates covering the final drive. On this particular M4, another problem is ALCO manufactured the glacis on its M4 Sherman tanks in the first half of 1943, taking 5 armored plates and welding them together. Again, you can see these weld lines. When I first saw this, I'm thinking, what in the world is this? I never imagined that that front plate, that's the most significant part of the armor on the entire tank, was going to have 5 different pieces of armor welded together. But this one does, as did every single M4 Sherman ALCO manufactured up until July 1943. Another major problem with the original M4 Sherman was the ammunition storage. Ammunition was stored conveniently for the crew to reach in racks right inside the wall of the hull in 3 locations. 1 rack on the left side of the hull, 2 racks on the right side of the hull. So the convenience was good, but the unintended consequence of all this was enemy rounds penetrating the hull where that ammunition was stored could ignite the ammunition, starting a fire and blowing up the entire tank. This was such a big deal that early M4 Shermans and other early Sherman tanks came to be nicknamed Ronson Lighters. How would you like to go out into combat riding inside an explosive Ronson lighter? Once the Army Ordnance Department realized that this was a problem with the design, its Band-Aid approach was to send armor plates out into the field that could be welded outside the hull at the location of each of these 3 storage racks. So one armor patch here on the left side of the hull, 2 armor patches on the outside of the hull. Eventually, companies began adding these armor patches in the factory. The ultimate solution was to get away from dry storage racks altogether and relocate ammunition storage in tubs underneath the turret floor that included glycol in those tubs to reduce the likelihood of fire. Now let's climb up on top of the hull and see some of the features that are hard to see down here at ground level. This hatch is so small you can't get out of it without twisting sideways, and even at that, struggling. I'm not that big, I'm only 5'8", and I have a hard time getting in and out of this hull. Imagine having a uniform on, having a weapon, maybe having other gear. Imagine having your tank on fire from that dry ammunition storage rack and trying to get in and out of the hatch hulls. Another feature to point out on the hull of this M4 is the radio antenna bracket. Every early production M4 was manufactured so that it could be converted as a command tank. The difference between a command tank and a regular tank in the platoon is command tanks had a second radio. That second radio would be up here in the right-hand side of the hull, so designers put a radio antenna bracket on all early production M4s. Now let's turn our attention to the turret. The turret of every Sherman cast from February 1942 through November of 1943 had the same part number, 50878. So you see that part number cast into the turret when you get up top. You also see the date that the mold for this cast was created, 143, January 1943. This turret was cast with a single hatch, the commander's hatch. There's no loader's hatch. A loader's hatch wasn't added until November 1943. The commander's hatch originally had a different cupola and different hatch covers than what you see here. The original design called for a split hatch cover to the commander's cupola and no vision cupola. This single hatch cover and the vision cupola were retrofitted to this M4 in 1944 or later. This M4 was designed with a pintle mount at the rear of the turret to hold the 50 caliber machine gun. The machine gun was intended to be fired by a crew member standing on the rear deck. All of that's been eliminated from this M4, and a new 50 caliber machine gun mount has been welded to that retrofitted commander's cupola sometime in 1944 or later. This modification enabled the commander to fire the 50 caliber machine gun while standing inside his hatch, rather than having a different crew member get out of the tank altogether and stand on the rear engine deck. Early production M4s all were manufactured with periscope sights for the gunner. That's it, just a periscope sight. So the gunner's sitting inside there and he's just looking up through a periscope. He can't see the end of his gun. He just sees something out there. The only way he can get oriented to where his gun is pointing is if he fires tracer rounds out of the coaxial machine gun. So not a very accurate targeting system at all. This was eventually replaced with a far more accurate telescopic sight, but early production M4s didn't have telescopic sights. Just quickly to cover other features here on top of the turret, we see a stowage mount for the 50 caliber machine gun. This was retrofitted to the M4. The M4 originally was designed to have a stowage mount located behind the turret. You also see a mount for a spotlight. You see the loader's periscope, perfectly adequate viewing for the loader. He didn't need to see accurately, he just needed to be able to see out, particularly since he didn't have a hatch. And then finally, you see a welded over mount that previously held another radio antenna. That's about it for the top of the turret. Now let's focus on the gun mount. This M34 was manufactured with an original M34 gun mount that consisted of the 75 millimeter gun, a very minimal rotor shield, and a minimal gun shield behind that rotor shield. Now, the original M34 mount called for the 30 caliber machine gun to extend out beyond the mount itself, providing very minimal protection for the machine gun, creating a significant weak point in the aperture through which the machine gun extends. The original M34 mount had 2 lifting rings. You see this one only has 1 lifting ring. And in fact, as you get into the details here, you can see this is completely different from the gun mount that left the factory. More armor has been welded all over the top of this gun shield. More armor has been welded on top of the rotor shield itself. You see a significant extension of armor to the right of the rotor shield. You see that that armor has been retrofitted for a telescopic sight that was a big improvement over the original design of a periscope sight. The turret, as designed, had another ballistic weak point at the right front part of the turret. The inside surface was scooped away partially to create clearance for the gunner to manually rotate the turret. Where that interior surface was scooped away, the turret was thinner, creating a ballistic weak point. You see that the fix for that was then to send armor out into the field to be welded over that ballistic weak point in what came to be known as a turret cheek. Now let's move behind the turret to see what's interesting on the engine deck. The extension of the turret is called a bustle. The purpose of this bustle is to create room inside the turret to put a radio. Since there's a radio in this bustle, designers put a radio antenna bracket right on top of the bustle. A couple other minor features: you see 2 brackets for pintle mounts to hold the 50 caliber machine gun as originally designed. I think these 2 L-shaped weld scars were for a stowage rack. I'm told this square weld scar is where a pintle was originally welded to hold machine gun stowage. Moving around to the side of the turret, you see a pistol port that's been welded shut. Now, this pistol port was welded shut because the Army Ordnance Department couldn't decide if it liked pistol ports or not. Originally, every M4 Sherman turret was manufactured with a pistol port. The purpose of that pistol port wasn't to shoot a pistol. The purpose of that pistol port was to give the loader a way to throw spent shell casings out and a way for the loader to receive additional ammunition in through that pistol port. I also have read that that pistol port was used to provide some additional ventilation in the turret if it wasn't in combat conditions. In April of 1943, the Army Ordnance Department decided, well, that pistol port creates a ballistic weak point, and it ordered that all of them be eliminated. Existing pistol ports were welded over like this one was. Turrets manufactured from that point forward for the next few months were manufactured without pistol ports. Troops in the field raised such a stink that the Army Ordnance Department reversed itself and ordered that turrets again be manufactured with pistol ports. The Army Ordnance Department quit sending kits out to the field to weld up existing pistol ports. So today, you see 3 different configurations. You see M4 Sherman turrets without any pistol ports molded in at all. You see M4 Sherman turrets that have functioning pistol ports, and you see M4 Sherman turrets like this one that have pistol ports originally manufactured that have been welded shut with an armor kit. The last thing to point out on the rear of the hull is the engine deck. This has the original design engine deck, a single armor plate with conventional hinges. This was not a good design. It was heavy. It was really hard to open it. I can't open it by myself, literally. A variety of improvements were made, culminating in a much better design. It's very rare to see an M4 like this one that still has the original rear hull deck. Before we go in the tank, let's get back down to ground level and look at a few additional exterior features. At the rear of the hull, at first blush, a person might say nothing to see here, but there's a lot to see here. This is a very heavily modified M4 Sherman hull. M4 Shermans were manufactured with a rear hull armor plate, armor doors set into that armor plate, 2 air cleaners, and 2 engine exhausts. This was manufactured that way. One difference between this M4 and other M4s is, rather than a single plate of armor for the rear hull, 2 sheets of armor were welded together. It's behind the air cleaner, but you can see a weld line. Now, that's not desirable. Every place you've got a weld, you've got another ballistic weakness. It was preferred to have a single sheet of armor. After this M4 came out in the field, modifications were made. One of the challenges with the original design was when the crew is opening the engine doors, they could smash into the air cleaners, breaking them. So to solve that problem, out in the field, crews welded door stops. You see a door stop welded on each side of this M4. Another limitation of the original design is you've got the engine fully exhausting just right behind here in a concentrated form, and there's going to be troops behind the tank, taking cover behind the tank, walking along, providing infantry support, joint attack, and they've got that exhaust blasting right into them. So exhaust deflectors were added. You see two fittings that have been added out in the field to this M4 to help mount those exhaust deflectors. The last thing to point out is this crank needed to start the engine. The engine behind these doors is a Continental R975 radial engine. To start that engine, you couldn't just hit the ignition inside. You had to take this crank, position it inside that opening, connect to a fitting inside the hull, and then turn that crank 50 times. Only after that could you hit the ignition inside in the driver's position to start the engine. Imagine having to do that in combat. The R975 engine came in an early version called the C1 and in a later version called the C4. The C1 delivered 350 net horsepower. The C4 delivered 400 net horsepower. The Continental R975 was a 9-cylinder gasoline, air-cooled radial engine designed for an airplane. When the Sherman tanks were being designed, airplanes had far more capable engines than automobiles did. And so an airplane engine was deemed appropriate to power the weight of the M4. The problem with that is every time you allocated a Continental engine to an M4 instead of an airplane, you had one less airplane. This M4 Sherman has a second-generation vertical volute suspension system. The main characteristic of a VVSS, or vertical volute suspension system, is a vertical volute spring. A volute spring is sheets of metal that have been arranged into a concentric spiral, much heavier duty than a conventional spring. The volute springs are set vertically behind this shield, giving the system its name. In addition to the vertical volute spring, you see two road wheels, you see a heavy-duty skid on top of the bogie assembly, and you see one return roller set off to the side. The road wheels are held onto the track with external guides that are relatively small. The initial version of the VVSS had a single roller wheel on top of the bogie assembly instead of off to the side, and no heavy-duty skid. So that's about it for the main exterior features of the M4. Let's go inside. We're inside the turret of the M4. One of the first features that strikes me is this steel mesh attached to the turret. The designers designed this turret with a steel mesh enclosing almost the entire turret. The only opening between the turret and the front hull was the little space that you see here. All of the rest of what right now is open has had that steel mesh removed. Crews found this steel mesh to be a heck of a hazard and a real inconvenience. Just imagine if mesh is covering all of this, if the turret is pointed straight ahead, okay, you've got some communication. But if the turret is rotated slightly, you're going to have the opening completely blocked by other parts of the hull, and you're trapped in here. Eventually, the Army Ordnance Department eliminated steel mesh from the M4 turrets, and to the extent the Army Ordnance Department didn't, the crew modified it in the field and took most of the mesh out, like you see in this example. Let's focus next on the ammunition storage racks. This, again, dry ammunition storage, Ronson lighter. There are 3 storage racks inside, one right here, next to a little bit behind the gunner, a little bit in front of the commander. And you can see, here's the door, so open down, you see the storage containers there inside. There's another storage rack right behind the bow gunner, but you can see there would be ammunition, again, right up against the hull wall. Third storage rack is over near the loader's position. I won't open that one. But a lot of time, just keep in mind, again, steel mesh, you can't get to it anyway. Let's look at the bustle. You see the compartment for the radio. Not a lot of room for anything other than the radio, but a good radio compartment. Going clockwise from the radio, you see the pistol port that used to be there and now has been welded over with a kit supplied by the Army Ordnance Department. Looking to the top of the hull, you see there's no loader's hatch. You can see the inside view of the loader's periscope. That was adequate for the loader's requirements. Coming back here now to the gunner's position, you see here's a special feature. So here is the manual control to rotate the turret, and that's where there's been a scoop out of the interior of the hull, creating that ballistic weak point that needed to therefore be covered over by that welded armor cheek. You see the fitting for the periscope sight that wasn't very good. You see a retrofit for the telescopic sight that worked pretty well. We have the driver's position that I'm sitting in, the bow gunner's position next to me, and the first thing to point out is the proximity of the ammunition storage racks. Look at it. Right next to me is the driver. I've got a bomb sitting there ready to go off if a Panzerfaust penetrates the hull. And same just to the right of the bow gunner. He's got a bomb sitting there ready to go off if an enemy round penetrates the hull. While we're on the bow gunner's position, notice that all the bow gunner had to use to sight his .30 caliber machine gun was a regular old periscope. He couldn't see much detail at all, very inaccurate. The only way he really could aim his bow gun would be to follow his tracer rounds, watch his tracer rounds through the vision periscope and adjust his aim accordingly. The last thing to point out in the bow gunner's position is the location of the floor hatch. Really pretty easy to access. It's not a hatch that you'd use on a regular basis, but if you needed to escape from the tank, escape from enemy fire, sneak out from a tank that has been immobilized, it might even be burning, and you'd get out underneath the tank and crawl away. In the driver's position, first thing a person notices is there is no steering wheel. Sherman tanks all steered by their brakes, just like modern heavy equipment does, characterized as skid steer equipment. Other than the braking and steering system, the rest of the controls were typical standard transmission automotive controls: a clutch, a gas pedal, and a shifting gear. It took me a while to figure out why was there a door on the ammunition storage compartment opening into the driver's position, and why is there a door that's blocked by the driver's seat? Just what's the story here? So as a person thinks about it, it makes sense. It's a workaround for how you're going to get ammunition into the loader's position if you don't have a pistol port, or the pistol port has been welded over and you don't have a loader's hatch. All that's left is get it in through here, take out part of the seat, feed the ammunition into the storage rack. The loader will be sitting in there to position it the way the loader wants. Now, we haven't covered everything about differences from one M4 Sherman tank to another, but hopefully I've said enough to give you the idea. Let's leave it there, and let's now compare the M4 Sherman with the EZ8 Sherman. Our EZ8 is serial number 62966. It was manufactured by Fisher Tank Arsenal in October 1944. Now just think of those two dates. The M4 was manufactured in April 1943. The EZ8 was manufactured just 18 months later, but it's a completely different Sherman tank. You don't need to be an expert to see from a distance that the EZ8 is a lot better than the M4. That just reinforces the point. Anytime you're in a discussion with somebody about what was the best tank in World War II, was it any version of German tank? Was it the T-34? Was it the Sherman tank? You got to get into details about, well, which Sherman tank are you talking about and which year of the war are you referring to? Let's look at the details of our EZ8. The first thing you notice is the difference in main gun. The EZ8 came with a 76.2 millimeter main gun. Larger projectile, higher velocity, longer range, a much better gun. Now, there were three versions of this M series 76 millimeter gun. Originally, the gun did not have a muzzle brake. Along the way, the gun came with threads for a muzzle brake, but no muzzle brake. And then finally, the gun came with a muzzle brake. That muzzle brake is a huge difference on a 76 millimeter gun. When the gun was fired, there's so much gas coming out of that barrel that it would kick up debris obscuring the sight of the gunner, delaying the amount of time it took for the gunner to reacquire a target and fire another round. So that muzzle brake really reduced that problem and put the gunner in a position to fire another shot quite a little bit quicker, all just because of a muzzle brake. This gun was too big for the turret on the M4 and for all of the early 75 millimeter Sherman tanks. The Army Ordnance Department tried to put this 76 millimeter gun in the turret that we looked at on the M4, but that turret was just too small, couldn't manage it. So this is a much larger turret, a T-23 turret. Another difference on the EZ-8 is the gun shield. Remember on that M4 was this narrow rotor shield, a lot of armor patches added to it. Here we've got one solid piece of armor covering the whole gun mount. And note the fitting for the coaxial machine gun. That machine gun is completely surrounded by armor, very well protected. Another significant difference on the EZ-8 is the upper front hull, or glacis. It's a different angle. This is a 47-degree angle, more forward. With that different angle on the glacis, it eliminated hatch hoods. No ballistic weak points on the front of this EZ-8, and the entire glacis is a single sheet of armor. No weld lines, no ballistic weak points. Look at the armor cover to the final drive. Instead of 3 sections bolted together, it's a single solid piece of armor. Again, far more ballistic protection than on the original M4. The larger turret, the bigger gun, and slightly thicker armor on the hull made the EZ-8 weigh 6,000 pounds or 2,700 kilos more than the M4. Designers needed to do something about that extra weight and responded in 3 different ways. One way was to widen the tracks. Instead of the 16-inch track of the M4, we now have a 23-inch or 58-centimeter track, helping to manage the ground pressure of that additional weight. A second adjustment was to strengthen the suspension system. Let's take a look at the differences in suspension on the EZ-8 versus the M4. You don't need to be a mechanic to see right away this is a totally different suspension system than what we saw on the M4. This is called a horizontal volute suspension system. You see the volute springs positioned horizontally, and not only are they positioned horizontally, but there are double volute springs here on each set of road wheels. In addition to double volute springs, there's a shock absorber on top of each bogie assembly. The HVSS suspension has double road wheels. To cover that wider track with the double road wheels, designers were able to put a huge guide in between those road wheels, making it a lot harder to throw a track. So all in all, this is an outstanding suspension system. Even though the EZ-8 weighs 6,000 pounds more than the M4, it created less ground pressure and had a smoother ride than the M4. What's it take to power all that weight? Fortunately, by this time, Ford Motor Company had created a new engine with 30% more horsepower than the original Continental R975. The Ford engine was the GAA engine, ahead of its time, all aluminum, 8-cylinder gasoline water-cooled engine generating 450 net horsepower. It was perfect for the EZ-8. Before we go inside the EZ-8, let's climb up on the hull. First thing you notice on the hull is how much larger the hull hatches are. So this would be referred to as a large hatch wet ammunition storage Sherman tank. Not only the hatch is a lot larger, but you see some other little finesse points. You see that the telescopic sight has been manufactured into the gun shield. You see that additional armor protection has been added to the gun mount to reduce the risk of bullet splash into the turret. Every EZ-8 came manufactured for wet ammunition storage, and we'll see the space for the wet ammunition storage containers underneath the turret floor when we go inside. Looking on top of the turret, you see that loader's hatch. Every T-23 turret had both a loader's hatch and a functioning pistol port. Big advantage over the M4. Now let's go around to the rear of the turret and look at the engine deck. The Army Ordnance Department took all of the lessons learned the hard way in the field with the M4 Sherman and with other early production Shermans and built those improvements in to the original design of the EZ-8 and had those improvements included in the original production of the EZ-8. A larger turret bustle, more room for the radio inside, a refined bracket for the turret radio. The 50 caliber machine gun was set up to be fired by a crew member standing on the hull deck, just like with the M4, but again, custom modifications would be made to relocate the firing position of the M4. It was originally set up to be fired from the deck because it was envisioned that this would be an anti-aircraft machine gun, and so you want more room to maneuver as you're working to shoot at an airplane flying by up in the air. The rear deck cover is, again, state-of-the-art. So if you had that M4 and you wanted this kind of cover, you had to jury rig it. But here, right from the factory, we have an armor plate in 2 pieces with a grilled top, further reducing the weight, accelerating cooling of the engine, 2 doors instead of 1, counterbalanced torsion bar hinges. There's room for a lot more here, a lot of stowage, a lot of accessories. It didn't matter here on this one, for example. It doesn't really matter what this was put on here for. The crew could do whatever they wanted with it. You see additional stowage attached to the rear of the hull. Just a far improved design. And notice also that on the right front part of the turret, there was no supplemental armor. The EZ-8 didn't need it. The turret itself was big enough to have plenty of room inside to manually rotate the turret without scooping out part of that interior wall, creating the ballistic weak point. Another improvement on the EZ-8 is an intercom telephone box mounted on the hull. If supporting infantry is taking cover behind the tank in cooperation with what the tank is doing, well, they can communicate through the intercom telephone. Now let's go inside the tank and see how improved the inside of the EZ-8 is compared with the inside of the M4. When you get inside the EZ-8, you just really start to appreciate how much better the interior of the EZ-8 is compared with the M4 we looked at earlier. One advantage is there isn't the ammunition in racks against the hull wall. Instead, the ammunition is in a much better location underneath the turret floor. There are lots of doors, a lot of space underneath. One of the best things about it is that this ammunition is all available to the loader directly. In the M4, the loader had to count on the bow gunner to feed ammunition from the rack by the bow gunner. He had to count on the commander or gunner to feed ammunition from the rack over on the other side of the turret. But in the EZ-8, everything's right where it makes the most sense and where it ought to be. I particularly like this ready rack right at the feet of the loader. And as you can see, it's like, okay, take the priority rounds, whatever you're going to need, put them right there so that all I got to do is just pull them out of here. Just such easy access. It's beautiful. The interior of this EZ-8 was restored by Fred Kager down in Fredericksburg, Texas, and nobody could possibly do a better job with a complete, accurate restoration of an EZ-8 interior than what Fred did here. I know that Fred went to multiple Army bases, got special access to a number of EZ-8 tanks to make sure that he knew exactly how everything was labeled, how everything was configured, and you see that throughout the interior of this tank. Everything is just plain old perfect. You see special room for stove, rations, folding bucket, a lot of room for gun parts, a lot of room for ammunition, signal flares, canteen locations. A lot of space in the bustle of the turret for the radio and storage of a lot more. Storage was just always an issue. There's never enough storage. I get a particular kick out of all of these boxes of grenades. So here I am in the loader's position, and I see a box labeled grenades right next to me. Reach in, it's like, yeah, sure, I've got several grenades right here, and if need be, I can just roll them out the hatch to anybody alongside the tank if we're really in a tight spot. This is a little bit of a work of art. It's almost like being in a toy store for somebody like me. And just position. So I'm in the loader's position, just like in the M4. The gunner and the tank commander would be on the other side of the main gun. The bow gunner in front on the right, the driver in front on the left. Notice how open the entire turret is. That steel mesh that was a pain in the M4 isn't here at all. There's easy communication for people, for ammunition, for anything that needs to be passed among different positions inside the turret. And as you think about the loader's circumstances, right away, one of the first things I think is, good thing the loader had his own hatch, because look at how big this gun is. How in the world would the loader in an Easy-8 get around the gun if the only hatch the loader could use to get in and out of the tank was through the commander's hatch. So this is just a much improved tank on the inside, just like we saw how much better it is on the outside and with key points of performance. The only disadvantage I see in the interior of the Easy-8 versus the interior of the M4 is the detail of the floor escape hatch. In the M4, it's easy to get to that escape hatch. In the Easy-8, for some reason, it's completely covered by the bow gunner's chair. It's going to take quite a bit more time to access that floor hatch. I don't know why it's designed that way. I'm just imagining that the designers allocated the space that would have made access to the floor hatch easy to a larger turret and to more storage. In the gunner's position, you see a combination periscope viewer along with a telescopic aiming sight, all in one. State-of-the-art, space-efficient design. You see the gunner can control the coaxial machine gun with the trigger on the floor alongside the trigger on the floor for the main gun. Looking into the commander's position, the commander had 2 seats available for him to take either of 2 positions. He could take a seat fully inside the turret with the hatch closed at the lower level, but he had very limited visibility even with this kind of vision cupola. So what would typically happen is the commander would take on the risk of opening the commander's hatch, sitting on the higher seat with his head up out the hatch, the way you see in the movie Fury, with everybody else safer buttoned up, the commander exposing himself so he's got that great visibility, even though it puts him at far greater risk in a combat environment. We've just scratched the surface of how different one Sherman tank can be from another. If you like this video, hit like and subscribe and let me know in the comments.